we've got something really foundational to dig into today. It's something you actually experience every single day, whether you realize it or not. Form, function, and space. The core ideas behind architecture and design.
Exactly, yeah. And, you might think of these as just textbook definitions, but really these three concepts, they've been debated for millennia.
It's pretty incredible, right? Like, I mean, these ideas are in the ancient temples and also in the sleekest modern structures. It all goes back to form, function, and space.
We want to look at what they really mean, how they've shifted over time, and then also the different ways that architects and designers interpret these concepts, and also how they end up shaping the spaces around us.
And for you, dear listener, understanding these principles is a little bit like getting a secret key, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You walk into a building and get this certain feeling, or you wonder why something looks the way it does. We're going to give you some of those reasons today. So let's start with form. When we say form in architecture, what are we talking about?
Okay, so at its most basic, form is like the physical manifestation of a building or a designed object. It's the shape, the structure, the thing you can see and touch.
Okay, so it's the thing you can touch, it's the visual identity. So then how does a shape communicate meaning or create emotion?
Right, so form has a powerful aesthetic presence, and that speaks volumes. Like just, for example, think about a skyscraper, all steel and glass, sharp lines. How does that make you feel compared to, say, a building with all these like gentle curves and natural wood? Totally different.
Right, yeah, totally different. Okay, you mentioned these categories of form. Geometric, organic, and abstract. Can you give some examples of each?
Sure. So geometric, that's like a minimalist house, just a perfect cube, no frills. It's all about clean lines and simple shapes. And then you've got organic form, which is a little bit more like, it takes cues from nature, like a concert hall with a roof that's all swoopy and curvy, like waves on the ocean.
I like that one.
Yeah. And then for abstract, think of something like a memorial, where maybe it has these angular shapes. They're not really representing anything specific, but, they evoke a feeling or a mood.
Oh, wow. That's a great way to think about it. So how has the way we use form in architecture changed throughout history?
It's a really interesting journey. So start with classical architecture. It was all about harmony and order. And the form, like you see in those Greek temples, it's so symmetrical. And they used really precise mathematical ratios. And they didn't just do this because it looked good. They thought it was like reflecting some kind of universal balance.
So those perfect proportions are actually connecting to a larger cosmic order.
Exactly. And then you fast forward to the Gothic period. Things change, and the focus shifts to expressing spirituality. You see those really tall cathedrals with pointed arches that seem to reach up to the sky, and then all that super intricate ornamentation, it's meant to draw your eyes and your spirit upwards, like towards something divine.
It's totally different from that grounded feel of classical architecture. And then things take another huge jump with modernism.
Yeah, with modernism, there was this deliberate break with the past. One of the big figures in modernism was Louis Sullivan, and he gave us this idea that form follows function. It became central to modernism.
I've definitely heard that phrase. What does it really mean, though?
So basically, he's saying, strip away all the unnecessary decoration. Don't get caught up in old styles. Just focus on what the building needs to do. And then let the form of the building come directly from that function.
So it's about being honest about the materials and the purpose. I can see how that was revolutionary, especially coming out of all those really ornate earlier styles.
And then, of course, you have postmodernism.
Yeah, postmodernism almost feels like it's pushing back on that idea of being purely functional.
Exactly. Postmodern architects, they were kind of reacting to what they saw as the coldness of modernism, like it was too sterile. So they brought back a sense of playfulness and even irony.
Like those buildings that have classical columns but use them in these unexpected kind of humorous ways, or the ones that have all these bold clashing colors.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's all about being expressive and breaking the rules a little bit.
So where does that bring us to today? With things like parametric design, it seems like form is taking on a whole new life.
It really is. So parametric design, it uses algorithms, computer programs to generate forms based on tons of data. I mean, they can take into account things like the wind patterns, the direction of sunlight, and even like the structural loads of the building itself. So the form isn't really predetermined anymore. It like emerges from all this data. It's kind of wild.
So it's almost like the building is being shaped by the environment around it and even by the laws of physics. I'd love to hear more about this idea of form as a language. How can a building's shape actually communicate something?
Well, historically, some shapes have gotten really tied to specific ideas or cultures. Like think about the dome. It has a long history, especially in Islamic architecture, and often symbolizes the heavens.
Right, and you see it a lot in mosques and other important buildings, so it's not just a shape, it's actually communicating something about the building's purpose and the culture it comes from.
Totally. Another example is the symmetry you often see in buildings built by authoritarian regimes. It can be seen as a way of visually representing control and power.
And then there's the classic example of skyscrapers. Those sleek glass towers, they really speak to modern technology and ambition, right?
Absolutely. They're like these symbols of progress and global commerce. So you're right, the form of a building can tell you a lot, even before you ever set foot inside.
It makes you realize that there's a lot more to architecture than just aesthetics. Architects have to think about all these different layers of meaning and function. Okay, so we've talked a lot about form. Let's move on to the second principle, function. What's the core idea behind function in design?
Basically, function is about the purpose of a building, or even just a specific room. It's about making sure that it works well for the people who use it. So you think about things like how they'll move through the space, how services will be delivered.
And how it will be used for its specific purpose. Like a school needs to be designed for learning, a hospital needs to be designed for healing, and so on.
Exactly. You have to think about all those practical requirements. It's about making sure the building actually does what it's supposed to do.
You mentioned different levels of function: basic, programmatic, social, and symbolic. Can you break those down for us a little bit?
Yeah, so basic function is the most fundamental stuff. The building has to provide shelter from the elements, right? And people need to be able to get in and out. The structure has to be sound. You know the basics.
The essentials.
Exactly. Then you've got programmatic function, which is more about the specific activities that will happen in the building. So if it's a school, you're thinking about classrooms and libraries and how those spaces will support teaching and learning.
Right, so each type of building will have its own specific set of programmatic functions.
Yeah, exactly. Then there's social function. This is about how the building encourages people to interact with each other. So you think about things like common areas, gathering spaces, places where people can connect and build a sense of community.
I'm already thinking about my favorite coffee shop. It has such a great social function.
Totally. And then the last one is symbolic function. So this is about how the building communicates meaning or represents certain values.
Like a courthouse that's designed to look imposing and symbolize justice.
Exactly. Or a monument that commemorates an important historical event.
Okay, so earlier we touched on this idea of form follows function. It came up when we were talking about modernism. Can you tell us a bit more about how that principle has influenced architecture?
Yeah, so like we said, that phrase, form follows function, it became kind of a motto for modernist architects. They were all about stripping away anything that wasn't absolutely essential and letting the purpose of the building dictate its shape. They felt this resulted in buildings that were honest and efficient.
It seems like a really logical approach, but I can also see how some people might find it a bit too limiting, maybe even a bit cold or sterile.
Yeah, you're right. There was definitely a backlash against that idea. Critics argued that focusing too much on function could lead to buildings that were maybe really practical, but not very beautiful or inspiring. They felt like it reduced architecture to just a kind of engineering problem. And that was one of the things that led to postmodernism, which was all about bringing back a sense of playfulness and expression.
So is form follows function still relevant today, or have we kind of moved beyond that idea?
It's definitely still relevant. I mean, function's always going to be important. A building has to work well, right? But these days, architects are also thinking a lot about things like sustainability, cultural context, and the user experience.
So it's not just about being purely functional anymore.
Right. It's about finding a balance. You want a building that works well, but you also want it to be beautiful, sustainable, and to create a positive experience for the people who use it.
Right, it's about the whole package. Okay, I want to ask about this idea of functional programming. What does that involve?
So functional programming is basically the very detailed planning that happens before any design work starts. It's where you figure out all the needs and goals of the project and really define what the building needs to do.
So you figure out things like how much space you need for each activity and how people will move through the building.
Exactly. And you also look at things like environmental standards, accessibility requirements, all the nitty-gritty details. It's like creating a really detailed instruction manual for the building.
So it's all about making sure that everything has been thoroughly thought through before you even start drawing up the plans.
Right. And it's super important because if you get the functional programming right, it makes it much more likely that you'll end up with a building that actually works well for its intended purpose.
It's kind of like laying a strong foundation. Okay, so we've covered form and function. Let's talk about the third principle: space. Space seems a bit more abstract than the other two.
Yeah, it is. Space is often called the invisible heart of architecture. It's the emptiness, the void, that's defined by the building's structure. It's not the walls or the floor or the ceiling themselves, it's the volume that they enclose.
Right, so it's the area that we move through and experience.
Exactly. And it's not just empty space. The way that space is designed can have a huge impact on how we feel and how we interact with the building.
You talked about space having physical, sensory, emotional, and social dimensions. Can you explain those a little bit?
Okay, so physical space is the easiest to understand. It's the actual dimensions, the measurements of the space. It's how big it is, how tall it is, and what shape it is.
So it's the basic geometry of the space.
Right. Sensory space is about how we experience the space through our senses. So that includes things like the light, the colors, the textures of the materials, even the sounds and smells.
So it's how the space makes us feel on a sensory level.
Exactly. Emotional space is about the feelings and moods that a space evokes in us. So a high-ceilinged, well-lit space might make us feel uplifted and energized, while a small, dimly lit space might feel more intimate or even claustrophobic.
That makes sense. And what about social space?
Social space is about how the design of a space encourages or discourages interaction between people. So a large open space might be good for a party or a conference, while a smaller, more enclosed space might be better for a private conversation.
So the design of a space can actually influence how we interact with each other.
Exactly. And architects think about all these different dimensions of space when they're designing a building.
So it's not just about creating empty rooms, it's about shaping the space to create a certain feeling or to encourage certain types of behavior.
Yeah, exactly. It's about creating an experience.
I'd love to hear more about some of the specific techniques that architects use to design space.
Well, one of the most important things is scale. The scale of a space refers to its size relative to the human body. So a grand cathedral-like space might make us feel small and insignificant, while a small, cozy room might feel more intimate and welcoming.
So the scale of a space can really influence how we feel within it.
Right. Another important technique is proportion. This is about the relationship between the different dimensions of a space. So for example, a room with a high ceiling and a narrow width will feel very different from a room with a low ceiling and a wide width.
Right, so it's not just about the size of the space, but about the balance between its different dimensions.
Exactly. And then there's rhythm. This is about the repetition of elements in a space. So for example, a row of columns can create a sense of rhythm and movement.
Right, and that can make a space feel more dynamic and interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Architects also play with transparency. This is about how much you can see through or into a space. So, for example, a glass wall can create a sense of openness and connection, while a solid wall will feel more closed off.
So transparency can be used to either connect or separate spaces.
Right. And then finally, there's the idea of transitions. This is about how you move from one space to another. So, for example, a narrow doorway can create a sense of compression before you enter a larger space, while a wide, open archway will feel more seamless and flowing.
So it's about creating a sequence of experiences as you move through the building.
Exactly. Architects use all of these techniques to create spaces that are functional, beautiful, and engaging.
It sounds like a lot to think about. You also mentioned different types of architectural space, like enclosed, open, and circulatory spaces.
Yeah, so enclosed spaces are the most basic. These are rooms with clear boundaries, like bedrooms, living rooms, offices. Open spaces are more fluid and undefined. They might be outdoor areas like plazas and courtyards, or they might be large indoor spaces like atriums or lobbies.
Right, and they often flow into each other or into the surrounding environment. What about circulatory spaces?
Circulatory spaces are the spaces that we move through to get from one place to another. So that includes things like hallways, stairwells, and elevators. And then there's transition spaces, which are kind of in between spaces. They're like thresholds or gateways that help us to adjust to a new environment.
So like an entryway or a foyer.
Exactly. And then there's this interesting idea of negative space, which is basically the empty space that's left over. But it's not just leftover space. It's
Yeah.
actually a really important part of the design.
So it's like the space between the objects.
Right. Negative space can be used to create a sense of balance, to highlight certain elements, or to just give our eyes a place to rest. It's like the pauses in a piece of music.
That's a really great analogy. You also talked about the importance of light and materials in shaping space.
Yeah. Light is essential. It can make a space feel warm and inviting, or cold and sterile. It can highlight certain features or create dramatic shadows. And the materials that we use also have a huge impact on how we experience a space.
Right. A room with wood floors and exposed brick walls will feel very different from a room with concrete floors and white walls.
Exactly. The texture, the color, the temperature, the materials, it all contributes to the overall feeling of the space.
It sounds like designing space is really a multisensory experience. We touched on some philosophical approaches to space earlier. Can you talk a little bit more about those?
Yeah, so one interesting approach is called phenomenology. It emphasizes the lived experience of space, how we perceive and interact with it through our bodies and our senses. Another interesting idea comes from Japan, the concept of ma.
I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I really understand it.
Ma refers to the intervals, the spaces between things. It's the emptiness, the void, that gives shape and meaning to the solid elements. So it's not just the objects themselves, but the relationships between them that are important. It's a really profound idea.
That's fascinating. So it's like the space between the notes in a piece of music. It's what gives the music its rhythm and structure.
Exactly. And that same principle applies to architecture. The spaces between the walls, the columns, the furniture, they're all just as important as the objects themselves. They're what give the space its character and meaning.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking about these three principles separately: form, function, and space. But how do they all work together in successful design?
Well, ideally, they should all be in perfect harmony. They should all support and reinforce each other. So the form of the building should express its function. The function should dictate the organization of the space. And the space should be designed to create a positive and engaging experience for the user.
But it sounds like it's not always easy to achieve that perfect balance. What are some of the challenges that architects face?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is just the complexity of the design process. There are so many different factors to consider: the needs of the client, the budget, the site, the building codes, and so on.
Right, and you have to balance all those practical considerations with your aesthetic vision.
Exactly. And sometimes those things can be in conflict. So it's about finding creative solutions that satisfy all the requirements.
It sounds like a real juggling act.
It is. But when it's done well, it's incredibly rewarding. There's nothing quite like seeing a building come to life that perfectly balances form, function, and space.
And creating a space that people really love to be in. Okay, so to really illustrate how these principles work in practice, I think it would be helpful to look at some specific examples. You mentioned the Guggenheim Museum, Falling Water, and the Church of the Light earlier.
Yeah, those are all great examples. So the Guggenheim Museum is famous for its iconic spiral ramp, which is both a striking formal element and a functional way to guide visitors through the art collection. And the Church of the Light is another great example of how light can be used to create a powerful spatial experience.
And what about Falling Water?
Falling Water is a masterpiece of organic architecture. The way that it integrates with its natural surroundings is truly remarkable. The house is built over a waterfall, and the cantilever terraces seem to float in midair.
It's like the building is part of the landscape.
Exactly. Frank Lloyd Wright was a master of blurring the boundaries between the built and the natural environments.
These examples really show how architects can use these principles in so many different ways to create unique and memorable buildings. So how are these principles being applied in architecture today?
Well, one of the biggest trends is sustainability. Architects are increasingly focused on designing buildings that are energy efficient and environmentally responsible. And that often means using new materials and technologies. But the basic principles of form, function, and space are still just as relevant as ever.
Right. It's not just about slapping solar panels on a building. It's about designing the entire building in a way that minimizes its environmental impact.
Exactly. And another big trend is inclusivity. Architects are increasingly focused on designing buildings that are accessible to everyone, regardless of their physical abilities or disabilities. So they're thinking about things like ramps, elevators, and wide doorways, but they're also thinking about the sensory experience of the space.
So making sure that the space is comfortable and easy to navigate for people with a wide range of needs.
Right. And then there's the growing importance of technology. Architects are using computer modeling and simulation tools to design buildings that are more efficient and sustainable. And they're also using new fabrication techniques to create buildings with complex and innovative forms.
So technology is really changing the way that architects design, but the basic principles are still the same.
Exactly. The principles of form, function, and space are timeless. They've been used to create great architecture for centuries, and they'll continue to be used for centuries to come.